Welcome to Esoteric Thoughts. I am Napashida, and I'd like to thank Esoteric first and foremost for having us come together, this wonderful panel, to discuss a very important topic which needs awareness, the topic of cults and trauma. We know that cults are very damaging. Well, this panel does, and I'm sure anyone out there who has experienced even family members in cults see the damage that it does. Usually people who are already traumatized, who already have emotional issues, are drawn to cults. And so today we will be speaking to a panel of experts, and these experts are professional experts, but they also have their own personal experience with cults. So I will just let everyone introduce herself, and I will start with the Dr. Alicia Powell. Please introduce yourself, doctor.
Thank you so much for having me. My name is Dr. Alicia Powell. I am a licensed clinical social worker, and I am also a cult survivor. I grew up in a very religiously abusive organization, and right now I work as a clinical therapist working with individuals, couples and individuals who have experienced religious trauma, but also have experienced a myriad of other challenges associated with various stressors. And I'm really happy to be here. That's pretty much it. Thanks so much.
Just jump right in and introduce yourself. I just want to get the ball rolling with Dr. Powell.
Okay, I'll go next then.
Oh,
sorry.
Go ahead.
I'm Stevie Noah, and yes, same kind of background. You might have seen me on another one of Esoteric's videos, but I grew up in a isolated environment, and I was part of the Assembly of God. So my background is very much that style of being raised, and I am now a religious trauma specialist, and I do specialize in helping people really create a life they love after they come out of the cult. So getting rid of triggers and being able to reestablish relationships and a love life and adventure and happiness and joy again. So yeah, that's me.
I'm Christina Babin. I am also a fellow cult survivor. I grew up in the Children of God, or as it's now known, the Family International. And I am a outspoken activist for survivors of this cult, but also tyrannical groups, high control groups. And my goal is just to make these kind of stories more real, let people know that there is hope after, and kind of just bring the topic out into the light and create less stigma for survivors.
I am Deborah Grace, and I also was in a very deprived childhood with Pentecostal religion was the main weave throughout my life. The last few years was in Hebrew roots, and I am now an author of Crucifying the Bible, writing my second book, which is utilizing the DSM-5 to juxtapose the scriptures against them to show how control-oriented they are and the mind control tactics they utilize. I'm also pointing out the oppressive nature of the scriptures, specifically against women and children. And I also briefly touch on slavery in the book. And so I am very outspoken against what religion does to society and the harm that it causes.
And I am Napashida. I am a internet personality. I also am in my career. I do counseling from birth to what I call transition, which is death. I'm a doula, a midwife, and a grief counselor. I'm also a cult survivor. I do still subscribe to a lot of the Bible and the teachings of, I guess you could say, the basic foundation of the tenets of being, following certain laws in the Bible. but I don't look at other people and say, because they don't follow what I do, they're wrong. So I do that. That's my healing. And I'm looking forward to discussing that with these wonderful ladies on this panel today. I do know that cults are not just dangerous, but I know that the programs are very solid. I know that the program that I was in from 2011, and then I started to break the programs about 2017. So those 6 years did a lot of damage that I'm still healing from. So I think I want to start there. When we leave cults, can we talk about how, even though you know it's wrong, you come out, how those programs are still on us, and is it important to just recognize it and then work on it? Or, because I know a lot of people come out and they say, oh, I'm fine, I'm done. So what about that part? Leaving the cult, but still the program is on you, even though you know it's wrong. Anybody can jump in.
There's so much.
Yeah.
I don't want to be the one, like, I don't want to be that, because we're all in here together. I'm gonna be like, because you might have a thought and then I say, okay, Stevie, but then Deborah might be like, oh, I want to say something. So this is just, we're just sitting together with our shoes off, our mimosas and whatever. And so just jump in. What about that comment? Anybody want to comment on what I put out there?
Yeah. So, like you said, some people come out of it and they think they're fine, right? But that's not really the case. Like my husband said he was totally fine. And he was in the Hebrew roots as well as I did. We met in religion. And when he came out, he said, I'm fine. But he didn't want to even talk about anything to do with religion. For me, it's been catharsis to write about it. But he hasn't even read my book. So, I mean, and I can't fault him for it because I recognize that that's part of his religious trauma syndrome. That's part of his program that still exists. For me, hearing somebody say hallelujah is a trigger, or let's pray before a meal. I'm like, oh my gosh, and some of those triggers, when you want to thank, when you feel grateful, it sometimes feels hard to put that into words. Like, what are you thanking? Who are you thanking? And for me, it's been a struggle to just be grateful in the moment. And I don't have to be grateful to anybody. I don't have to thank anything for it, but just different things like that. And that's just a really minor example, but that's the first thing that came to my mind.
Yeah, that's a good point. I like that. One thing I would say is, I think one of the things that is kind of like a quiet symptom that a lot of people don't talk about is the crushing loneliness of losing your tribe and losing that community. And it's not something that you're really comfortable talking about because it sounds like, oh, maybe you want to go back. It also sounds like, oh, I don't fit in here in the outside world. So it's kind of one of the things that I don't hear a lot of people talk about, especially right in the beginning. But most of us can kind of say, hey, yeah, those first few years, I was so alone in the world and felt so isolated and like an alien. Our group was so controlling and so apart from the world. We were in it, but we were apart from it. So we couldn't have relationships with people outside. Everybody was an enemy. Everybody was judged. Everybody was not safe. And we weren't allowed to read books or keep up with just whatever the culture was of where we were, we weren't able to keep up with it. So leaving, you come out and you really are an outsider. You grew up so differently. People can't relate to you and you can't relate to them. And so that's one of the things that I think we have a high rate of people that return back to cults after they leave because of that.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I just want to say, because this is actually the area that I specialize in with my clients. And what I think a lot of people will find is when they leave, they not only don't know how to be in a normal world, but they actually don't know really how to have proper relationships, right? That's with themselves, other people, sexually. So if they want to be in a relationship, they don't know how to do that right. They expected it to be easy, and they've got all kinds of triggers around it. Even money and relationships at work, like those kinds of relationships are really skewed. You know, money's the root of all evil and all the other things. And usually if you're in a cult, right, where like same kind of thing what Christina was in, you don't even have access to your own money. You didn't even have that kind of thing. So and then what else? There's money, there's relationships, there's job, there's decision making. Decision making hasn't even been an option typically. So people will constantly, they'll come out and they'll constantly be looking for someone to tell them that their decision is okay, that they can make that decision, or help them decide what to decide. And so all of these faculties that I guess these normal things you should be learning as you're growing up, and, you know, having different kinds of relationships and trying different things and having money and going to jobs, I don't know, just all that stuff is really stunted. It's almost like everyone I've talked to, and at least that I've worked with, they feel behind. They feel like they're a 4-year-old compared to everyone else that's in their 30s, you know, and 40s and that sort of thing. They feel like a child. And it's very common for them to just be like, I feel, you know, when I'm having conversations with my friends, even, they just sound so much smarter and they're so much more mature. And I don't know how to be like that. And so it's just the very simple things of being a human being that they just aren't comfortable with, being themselves, really. Yeah.
I think it's also really easy to get into like the whole analysis paralysis, where there are so many decisions to make and the world is so wide open that it just feels so overwhelming. And I think many times people have to, you know, be in a place where they have to decide, what do I want to do versus what have I been told to do? And that can be a really hard dynamic to break, because if so much of your life is based on these sets of rules and you're so used to following these sets of rules, these guidelines, when you have no guidelines and the world is a big, wide open place, it can feel really overwhelming, but also very anxiety producing, because you don't even know yourself at that point, because you don't know what you truly want to do versus what you've been told that you should want to do in those moments. And so there's that cognitive dissonance that comes with that.
Wow. What about when you do break free, you don't meet wonderful people like all of you on the panel, and because I think it was Christina who said something about being pulled back in. That gave me chills just hearing her say that. And I was like, oh yeah. What about those people who they break out, they feel like, okay, I'm free, but they don't have support groups? You know, the families are there and the families are cheering them on, like, I'm so glad you're out, but then the families go about their business, like how I think Stephen, all of you talked about being disconnected in a way, like feeling like so behind. Let's talk about those who break out and then somehow they're sucked back in because they don't have that support group.
Yeah, I think that for me is a super important part of this whole puzzle. And I think stigma and education are things that, like, I'd like to talk about. Creating less stigma, which is what these conversations are doing. And we're allowing the subject to be talked about in a non-exploitive way, in a way that's not legacy media, just, you know, they use these stories as, you know, headlines, and it gives people a sense that people who fall for cults or get trapped in them are ignorant or somehow, you know, at a deficit for morals. And we have to get rid of those ideas so that when somebody gets out and they talk to people kind of understand where they're coming from and understand the level of support that they need. And I think that's not something that we've had in our history. We've not had an openness or an education as to what it really means to get out of a cult. We're starting to have more information about what it takes to get out of an abusive relationship. And it's very, very similar. It's very difficult for people to leave an abusive spouse. And the similarities between an abusive partner and a cult are very similar. And so we need the world to kind of take notice and understand that this is something we have to help people with. And it's something that's going to continue happening. So we can't put our head in the sand any longer. We're all coming out, we're having a voice, and we're saying, look, this needs to be dealt with. And that's what these conversations are doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
The
yay.
strongest fear, they say, no, I love that. The strongest, they say sometimes that the strongest fear is the fear of the unknown. And so on what you just said, Christina, like when someone chooses to leave a cult, it should be the opposite of people looking at them like, you know, what's wrong with you? How did you even get into that? It should be like, wow, you're really brave. You're really brave, because that fear is so overwhelming that's why people go back. You know, if you come out, you have enough courage to get out, and then sure, you get out and you don't know how to handle relationships or money or jobs or life or make decisions or do all the things. It is very easy to get sucked back in because you have no tribe. You have to create your own tribe. You have to make those decisions. You have to have sometimes bad relationships to understand what a good relationship actually is and how to choose that. And so it's almost like when you get out, there's a bit of murky waters and like, you know, it's a rough ride at the start. I know that when I left to go to college and that whole thing, of course I was weird. I didn't have the education that other people had. I didn't have the social skills that other people had. I was the weird girl in the corner kind of a thing. And I did pick really bad friends. You know, I had friends that would gossip or, you know, say things. I don't know. It was just really bad. There was always some sort of fight at the end of it, and then boyfriends and that kind of thing too. And it took a while for me to figure out how to respect myself, how to make my own decisions, how to pick the right kinds of people to be around. You know, and even with jobs and say, who do I want to be? What do I want to do for work? All that kind of stuff just took a while to learn. And so it takes a very strong person to get out and to stay out. It takes a lot of courage, a lot of strength, and a lot of self-development. And so anyone like yourself that got out and all of us, it really should be a huge pat on the back.
I actually in my very second interview for my book, I talked about that with the interviewer. One of the closing things I said, he said, do you have any advice for anybody who might be watching this? And I said, you know, I hadn't really thought about it, but I do want to say that anybody who is questioning their faith, it takes courage to do so. And because it takes courage to question your faith, you're already a badass. And you know, so obviously he was giving resources. That's one of the things he does. Harmonic atheist. He very good at describing those coming out of religion stories. And it's interesting that you talked about the parallel about how religion can be like a bad relationship. What I find is that many people who are in religion don't have a good example of what a good relationship looks like. So many people in religion are already in bad relationships. And so finding that compass, it is like jumping ship, and you have to swim to shore. And that takes a lot of energy. It took me about 2 years of just living, just day by day, just going through the motions, trying to figure out what's my purpose? Who am I anymore? I have no identity left, because you don't have personal agency in religion. You must fit the mold. You don't have the proper education. I grew up like yourself, Stevie, in homeschooled. So I was taught creationism, and then 41 years as a Christian, believing the Bible, and I'm behind the 8 ball, and figuring out like, oh my gosh, I don't even know what real science looks like. I don't know what critical thinking looks like. So I had to dig and dig and dig and find these resources for myself. But as these communities are growing and platforms like this are being created, and And my goodness, all these wonderful, brilliant minds are coming together. We're creating a safe space for people who can take that step, and we can give them the resources and welcome them in with open arms and say, you're not alone. And that's one of the biggest things that's part of why I have this mission. And I applaud anybody else who's creating this space for others. And yeah, so anybody who is watching, you are not alone. You are a badass already.
Yes, awesome.
Yes, wonderful words of encouragement. Talking about relationships, and I want to relate it to how women in relationships are brought into cults by their spouse quite often. Can we speak on that? I mean, even if we have any personal relationship, let me get my ball rolling. Actually, it was the opposite. When I was married, and he was the one that I was trying to bring into the thing. And he was like, no, because I heard Deborah say, you mentioned your husband. I'm assuming that you both were practicing together. Because, but I do want to, we don't have to just talk about women being brought in, but let's talk about how one spouse brings another spouse in, and what damage that does, or how that affects the relationship once you come out.
Yeah. Well, I'll say, I think so much of life is about influence. And when it comes to influence, a lot of times your partner, your spouse is a huge influence, because that's somebody that you've pledged to spend your life with. And so there's a lot of, I want to say, kind of power and control dynamics that can come along with somebody pulling someone into an organization, because many times they can feel like they have no choice. You know, this person is saying, this is the truth. This is what I found, and you need to be here with me. And sometimes it also means that they give an ultimatum saying, you know, I can't be with you if you don't believe this like I do. And a person is faced with making a choice of, is this a choice that I want to make? How does this impact my children? How does this impact my family? And that influence can also lead them to really let down their guard, and also be more susceptible to these high, control organizations.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I found this, I guess the group that I was in is very blatant with this tactic of using the opposite sex to bring people in. So we had our cult was very sexual. It was a sex cult, and sex was something that they used to get money, to get new converts. And it really is a powerful tool. It's one of those things that if you can control somebody's sexuality, you can control everything about them. And if you look at cults overall, somehow there's sexual exploitation, and be it control in a marriage, and or telling them they can't have sex or they can have sex. So there's a lot of relational and sexual issues that come along with cults, which is a warning sign for any coercive group. But also, again, back to the abusive spouses or abusive partners, like it's a powerful tool of control, and it's used to keep people in. It's used to get them to do what you want, and they will use your partner. They will use the people you are interested or love to control you. And that's something that you should always be looking out for if anybody is trying to control that aspect of you in any way, be it getting you to be more promiscuous or less. If it's control of your emotions, of your attachment, of your sexuality, it's a huge red flag. And there you have it.
Oh, go ahead, please.
I just wanted to dovetail on that, the emotions and the control over emotions in religion. And I don't think it applies just to cults per se, but many religions are steeped in emotional invalidation tactics, in that, your emotions don't matter. And that goes to the inability to I don't want to get off track, but the control over whether you and your emotions and your decisions are valid, and the control that they take over that, I think it needs to be pointed out, and it needs to be expanded on in that aspect, because if you don't have the ability to process through your emotions properly, you're stuck. And it goes to what Stevie was saying earlier, in the stunting that happens and the inability to have proper interactions and relationships with other people if your emotions are just completely dismissed.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to add to that as well, because like I wasn't brought in obviously by a spouse or anything like that. And I mean, a lot of the clients that I do work with have been raised in it. But I do want to say that, you know, my mom being a specific key factor in dismissing my emotions on a regular basis. And literally, I remember having a conversation on the stairwell at our house about, you know, how I was feeling and what I was, and she goes, well, you can't trust your emotions. It was just straight up that way. You can't. And so just constantly always telling me that my emotions were false, that what I was feeling was fake, that I couldn't trust anything about myself. I couldn't trust anything I was feeling or thinking. It's all that control. It's that, I think it's Stephen Hansen that has the bite model, the behavior control, intellect control, right? Thought control, emotional control. And so when someone's controlled like that, whether it's, you know, coming from their spouse, it's usually someone they love, right? Someone they love is trying to coerce them that way. The whole control factor creates fear. And then, you know, the more fear that's built up around those areas of your life, especially around the emotional control and all that stuff, it's just, you start basically getting this whole loop going, this feeling loop of if I think this way, if I do this thing, if that, you know, if I do anything that's not normal, or anything that my partner or my mom or my father or whatever, the person that's in the leadership role in your household doesn't like, there's going to be a repercussion to this. And the God, of course, there's always repercussion for the God that you believe in as well. And so that creates that fear. And the more fearful you are, the easier you are to control. And whether that be through sex or anything else, it's just really they're playing on fear. And by taking all these pieces of you and your behavior, your intellect, your, you know, thought and your emotion, all that, it's the fear that they're instilling. And then that's what makes it so scary to try to change or be yourself or make your own decisions, is because you know there's going to be a punishment at the end of that.
Yeah, I call it the reward punishment cycle.
Yeah.
Yeah. Didn't you
Absolutely.
get in trouble, Christina, for just being a little girl and thinking daydreaming? I think it was.
Oh,
you got
yeah, daydreaming was absolutely forbidden. You could be, they would do an exorcism on you if you were caught daydreaming too much. Your thoughts were not your own. Yeah, so the reward punishment cycle is something that is used, you know, a lot of abusive relationships, but what it is it's creating joy, reward, happiness, or fear, punishment, negative thoughts. And you're on this roller coaster, which I believe you can become kind of addicted to. The highs are very high and the lows are very low. And you experience that in these high control groups and high control relationships. And it's very hard to get out of that mindset, but they'll start right away. You know, when they're bringing you in, they will start with that love bombing, or, you know, high spiritual highs where you feel connected to the universe. And then it's going to drop to the fear, like Stevie is saying, to the fear, to the shame, and it's going to just go up and down. And then you're kind of trapped in it.
Yeah. And, you know, when you said that, it kind of brings to mind the whole idea of people going up and down, black and white, because religion, and especially religiously abusive organizations, don't give a lot of room for nuance. And I remember growing up, you know, there was the whole idea of like sinning on the level of a thought. Like if you had a bad thought, it was a sin. And that whole idea of I can't think anything, I don't know what to think because I don't want to sin. I don't want, you know, God to be mad at me. And I want all my thoughts to be pure. I want to be a good person. And so if I have a bad thought, I'm a bad person. It's the sin of thought. You thought something that was wrong. And that level of control really impacts like your emotions, but also ability to problem solve and just think, because you don't want to sin in your thoughts.
Yeah.
And it is addictive.
Go ahead. No, get your
I
thought
just
out.
wanted to say that. I love that you said that. And I just wanted to share this as well for anyone that's listening, because I remember realizing that I was addicted to that roller coaster ride in a relationship. The high good feelings of love and all this stuff. And I remember noticing in my relationships with partners that if it was going too good for a while, I would find a way to create a problem and create a fight, and it would be a big juicy fight, and then we'd fix it afterwards and whatever. And that felt like what a relationship should be like to me. And for a long time, and it wasn't until I had a very stable person that wasn't a Christian or didn't have that kind of background in my life that he pointed out. He was like, it's my husband actually, 15 years ago. He's like, that's not normal. You don't need, that is not
Right.
normal. That's not what a good relationship is. And I was like, oh my God, you're right. But I just craved it over, and it went for a really long time. So yeah.
Well, you can actually be addicted to cortisol.
Yeah,
And that the fight or flight, right? So
Yeah.
your body gets used to that cortisol and it craves it. So on a physiological basis, this is what happens. My mom was converted to Christianity in a holy roller, hell, fire, and brimstone sermon at 12, and ended up being, and I don't know if it was had to do with all the generational issues, but she was diagnosed with manic depression when I was 16 years old. And I could see that reflection of her highs and lows in religion that carried over into life.
Yep.
Wow. Speaking of mental illness and things that I'd say this, I'm glad we have Dr. Powell here. She can bring in the professional opinion. I'd say that enhances, I guess, the tie to the cult, or the like Stevie said, the need to have that dysfunction, which is reflected in the cult as far as the cult leaders controlling the group. So speaking about psychosis, I had someone say to me, and someone in my life personally said, all religion is, it's psychopathy, it's sick, it's mental illness. So, I sat back and I was like, I think he's onto something. But, talk to us about mental illness, and not just cults, but believing in, a God. Is there a thin line? I'll start with Dr. Powell, and of course, everyone, let's join in.
I think there is kind of a thin line. I wouldn't say that all mental illness is due to religion, all religions due to, mental illness, and make that
Right.
big generalization. I think there's definitely instances where those things are very interconnected. And when we think about the DSM and, how we use it to diagnose, there really isn't that allowance for those religious fueled psychosis and things like that. We typically say, OCD or something like a compulsion, and that's how it's typically been framed a lot of the time. But I think that that it's something that's worth talking about. It's not always a black or white. Sometimes it's a combination of somebody's stressors, their trauma response, what their life has been like, that really kind of lead to the development of some of those mental disorders and diagnoses. And sometimes it's the other way around, where they do have a disorder or diagnoses already, and then the religion that they're in or their high control group really accentuates and makes it even that more difficult to navigate, because they already had some struggles already there. So I think it's not always like which came first, the chicken or the egg. It really depends on the person, and that, it's not necessarily possible to make that generalization, but we do have to recognize that there is a lot of times a familial component of that, where like if you leave a high control group, you're also leaving your family. And so that role of family and attachment and what we know about trauma can be, kind of I guess the icing on the cake when it comes to a mental diagnosis and what that means for trying to get out or to live life differently than how you were raised to live life.
Yeah, that's a good point. That I think also there are tactics that coercive groups use to kind of induce a psychosis and make you more pliable, which I'm sure you know about. But the psychic driving, the fasting for days on end, the group humming and chanting over and over again, you can create highs, you can create hallucinations if that's done long enough. And a lot of people have these spiritual experiences, which, if done by yourself or done in a healthy way, I'm sure can lead to some spiritual enlightenment for you. But when it's done by somebody who wants to then weaken your mental state and open your mind up and then implant ideas and thoughts, it can be very dangerous. And we know that like certain parts of the brain light up when these activities are done for long periods of time. The lack of food, the lack of sleep, the repetitive humming and chanting, and it can even be so simple as an argument or an interrogation that doesn't end. And you can create a psychosis or a altered state in which somebody can really believe that they're seeing spiritual things and become an even stronger believer because they've had an experience.
Absolutely.
I find it super interesting that many of these organizations will utilize these tactics and create an environment that is conducive to people who will prey on the weak, because you have these people who you trust who are telling you, this is the right way, this is the right life, these are the right decisions that you need to be making. And because they have been so torn down intentionally, they have no boundaries. They don't have proper critical thinking skills. They don't have good decision-making skills. And it creates an environment that is a breeding ground for people who prey on those people. And I find that to be extremely disturbing in the research that I've been doing lately for to try to help humanity, honestly. At the end of the day, that's the mission.
Well, think about having to pray. They're like, you have to pray 24/7. You always should be in prayer. I mean, that's consistently you're in your head going, I should be praying. I should be thinking good thoughts. I should be doing that.
Yep.
I should. And there's shame and there's guilt and fear if you're not doing that. And so it creates almost like an OCD behavior in your own head, however you choose to, however that manifests for a person. I know from my experience being, that there's that whole, what do they call it? Unfreezing, change, refreezing. So the breaking down is the unfreezing. So I used to get sat down in the living room by, my mom and all of her friends, and they would just do the whole, you are bad, you need to confess your sins in hours, until my eyes were puffy and crying. And from that, I would say that that's when my quote unquote psychosis set in, because it was after those experiences over and over and the breaking down of all that, and then them putting into me that I was a bad person, a bad child, bad whatever, not glory to God, that I started having the traumatic nightmares. And for 15 years, I had those traumatic nightmares where I literally thought I was being attacked by demons every single night. I became, I developed insomnia. Obviously, I was afraid to go to sleep. I developed a lot of anxiety and depression because when you don't sleep and you feel like you're a bad person, and it becomes this loop. And so, yeah, the tactics they use can create, I guess, a form of psychosis if you're in it, if you can't get out of it, if you're stuck there. I know another lady I was talking to never ever had anything like this happen before, but she became a Christian once she was around 16. And after that age and doing all of the rituals and things they have to do, she ended up in the fireplace at her house, crawling around and going and doing all kinds of weird stuff till her family was able to bring her down and get her to a therapist or someone that she could properly see. And she literally thought she was a demon. So whatever happened in the church when she decided to go kind of brought on, I guess, a sense of psychosis. And it's just that breaking down. So that's that, like Steve Hansen calls it the unfreezing. Then they change you. and then they refreeze all these new beliefs in you. And that's, I believe, what happened to me and what happened to this other particular person as well.
Wow. That just sounds like classic programming, mental programming, which it is. Listening to this, I really want to put it on the table and just, I feel like it's an elephant in the room, but for me, we say religion and cult. I'm not saying this panel specifically, but I mean, in the world, we say religion, cult, but really I'm seeing cults as just startup religions that didn't really pick up. They didn't really get, they don't have that strength as such as Christianity, which, because I believe, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, they started so long ago, in the ancient world where a lot of things weren't, there weren't human rights specifically the way we are today. So, I mean, do you see it, any of you, or do you want to talk about the differences? Because I really don't. The only thing is, like, I see it's like the big, we've got McDonald's and then we got mom and pop little hamburger stand. Cults to me and religions are the same. But what about that? And now I'm talking about from a spiritual and from the mental effect on people level, not about, of course, the power that they have. Anybody want to comment? I mean, everybody does, but just anyone.
Can I just briefly say that, because I know, I think Alicia has a better understanding, even Christina has much deeper understanding to this, but I would have to say that many religions that most would not call a cult, if you're in it long enough and they just chip away at you little by little by little by little by little, it can become very dangerous. It can be very disrupting to your persona. I was numb. I didn't have any feelings at all. I wouldn't allow myself to bring up any emotion, whether it was I'm frustrated, I'm angry, I was cold and numb all the time by the end of my time in religion, in the Hebrew roots movement. And it was so hard to find my way back, but I kept thinking failure is not an option. I have to find my way back, otherwise what's the point? And yes, you have those fleeting thoughts, but they scared the shit out of me. That what if that thought continues, that what's the point? And they chipped away little by little. I had no emotion left.
Yeah, wow. So a good book to read on this particular subject is Thought Reform. And it's really good. One of the things I like about it is he talks about milieu control, and which is, I believe, the French word for your surrounding, like how much you're it's about how much of you they're controlling. And so your thoughts are one thing, which I think is what a lot of religions have a tendency to do, is try to control your thoughts and your wishes and your dreams. For me to actually call a religion a cult, it has to also have control of your environment, control of your location, control of who comes in and out of your home, your life, whether or not you're allowed to leave. But the thought control is, like you're saying, is very, very important. It's sometimes easy for us to recognize when somebody is physically abusing us or when they're physically holding us down. It's a lot harder to pick up on they're trying to control my thoughts. And it's something that you're going to see kind of across the board, whether it is a cult or it's just a destructive group or a high control group or an abusive relationship. And so I think you're making a really good point about the control of the thoughts and how little we were allowed to think for ourselves and how scared we were taught to be of our own thoughts and wishes. And that's the thing that is really difficult to break. I grew up my whole life in that cult, and it was not very difficult compared to this challenge, to recognize like, okay, I was physically abused, I was raped, I was beaten, I was imprisoned, I was a slave. But to get used to, to not be afraid of my thoughts and wishes has taken me years and years to, first of all, acknowledge, and then second of all, challenge.
Yeah, I think in a lot of times it's definitely like an ongoing challenge. It's not something that just like concludes at the end of like leaving a group. It's like an ongoing, lifelong kind of, all right, this is just going to be my cross in a way to bear and process and think about.
It's your crucible.
Yeah, in that way. This is just kind of what it is. You can't divorce yourself from your upbringing and what you've been indoctrinated by. You can move forward, but there still is those remnants that are still part of your psyche.
Yes.
Wow. My heart goes out to all of you, especially Christina. I do want to mention that I do work in the Valley here in Phoenix, and there was a particular woman, it was in 2017. She was a part of that church, the Children of God. And sadly, she went into prostitution. She left the church, but then she went in. That's how I met her. She was at a women's shelter, and so I think we should discuss. This is a very sensitive topic, but sexual abuse. Really make that. We have to talk about the sexual abuse. Now, again, see. I'm thinking of Catholic Church when I say sexual abuse, but we're going to talk about the cults, right? It's like, for me, it's like they're the little babies of these bigger churches. These cults are just the terrible children of the bigger Abrahamic faiths. But anyway, cults and sexual abuse. Why is it that families on a level of, I'm going to say mothers especially, why is it that we sit back in cults, and forget about why, how does a person get to the point where they know that their children are being abused and they continue to let that happen? Of course, I want to start with you first, Christina, and then everybody just chime in.
Well, everybody's going to agree with me on this one. It's hands down cognitive dissonance. You can only hold one belief in your mind. So if the cult is all good and all powerful and all right, then they also cannot be bad and evil and asking you to do a terrible thing. And it's just something that we have found that humans struggle with, is that if they already believe and they're a believer, it's really difficult to break that and break out of that. There's also the conditioning that our parents had of, I like to use the analogy, which is, it's not a scientific analogy, so don't take it that way, but it's the frog in the boiling water. If you put a frog into boiling water, it's going to jump out. But if you put a frog in water and you slowly heat it up, it's going to boil without it realizing what's happening. And so it's all done in stages. It's not done. No parent goes into a cult and says, oh yeah, I'm going to let them abuse my children. The abuse starts with the parents. It starts with them. They become so conditioned and it becomes normalized. So then it's just another step forward. Everything that was done in our group was done in stages. It started out with no control in your own personal life of your sexuality, no holding hands, no getting married, no romance. Once that was done and everybody gave over their sexuality to the group and to the leader, then it was flipped on them, but they adjusted just fine because they were already used to giving over control of their sexuality. So then once he said, oh, now you're going to become swingers, everybody was like, well, I already listened to him about my sexuality, so it's just the same thing. Then he started prostitution, and then he started encouraging people to have sex with children. So it was a stair step downhill. It was a de-evolution into insanity, but it was done slowly and slow enough. But it all started with that control factor of giving control of your body to the cult and to the leader. And that can happen in a relationship as well. Giving over control, not understanding consent, not understanding body autonomy. And I get passionate about this. But yeah, it's a good subject. Now other people can talk, sorry.
When you
Yeah.
have a hierarchy of in any religion or a cult, you have a hierarchy, and when you have a God who is verbally abusive to his children in the Bible, you get conditioned that you're a whore. Ezekiel, there's a whole chapter in Ezekiel where God calls his children whores over 30 times. And when you have somebody who's a mouthpiece for that God, then telling and stepping into that role as that mediator, as an anointed person of God, and you have put your faith and your trust in this person as that mouthpiece, then that ability to control as this vicarious person acting as God becomes easier. And I don't think it necessarily takes a real high level of effort once you have been conditioned over and over and over. There are specific offshoots of religion that are very, very good at continually drilling into you week after week after week, sometimes multiple times a week, how bad you are. You're so terrible that you made God kill himself. You know, and when you have that brainwashing over and over and over, it gets to a level that you don't question anything anymore. And you have these seminars that women, the wives, are to go to tell them exactly how to act and be in their relationships. I went to one of those and it really does a number on your personal sexuality and your ability to have really healthy sexual relationship with your partner.
Wow. I want to add some information, and then Stevie and Dr. Paul, I don't know if we heard from you, but I would like for you to still make a comment on what I put on the table about the sexual abuse and parents. But Deborah, you made me think of something when I was in the cult. Well, when I was practicing with these people along with them, and I was one of those women the women would come to me and I would counsel them if they had problems in their marriages. But I do remember before that, when I was being conditioned, I was told, you have to know you're a whore. And I was like, I've never been a whore, but they kept telling, I'm laughing. Maybe part of it is nervousness. The other part is that it was ridiculous even at the time, but I wanted to be a part of it. They're like, no, you are a whore. God said you're a whore. And once you realize you're a whore, you will be a Proverb 31 daughter, a beautiful wife and wonderful. And finally, they broke me down and I was like, okay, yeah, I'm a whore and I'm a demon. And they were like, oh, wonderful, Napa, now you will teach all those women what to do. And I was like praised. So women would contact me and if they had problems with their husbands, mostly it was domestic violence and a lot of sexual abuse in their marriages. And part of me, at the time, I would end up at the end not dare telling the women to leave, because that would be like, no way, you don't do that. But it was really hard for me to tell these women, even though they're like, well, my husband wants to, and we're all grown ups here, sodomize me. that was one of the group's doctrine, like they can sodomize their wives. And I was like, well, God doesn't really want that to happen, but I'm not telling you to leave your husband. So, I mean, basically, I want to share that where I was torn. And I really, at the end, I started just telling women, you got to leave. Because there was a scripture, like a loophole. You can separate. In Paul, I don't know if anyone who's familiar with the Bible knows that scripture, like you may go and separate, but don't divorce. So that was the most that I could tell them. And I mean, that hurts me. I'm ashamed that I was part of that. But I do remember that. I remember being broken down, just what you said, told I'm a whore, and then I was praised, and I could teach the other women how to be good wives. So yeah, that was pretty bad. I really wish I could have told them, he's a jerk. You should leave him. Oh, side note, I remember one of the sisters that I did counsel, like 4 years later, since I've been out of the cult, she contacted me, and she was still there. And I, of course, just told her, this is wrong. What I was doing was wrong. Get some help, find this outlet. And she lives in Alaska. So, it's bittersweet, but I just wanted to share that personal story. You're absolutely right. Yeah, so I'll pass it on to whoever wants to. I know I cut in with the other two ladies, but yeah, I wanted to share that.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's one of those things where you're controlled, so you do what you're told at the time, right? And then you look back and you're like, oh, what was I thinking? But I just wanted to say that I think that, and this is my own personal belief, but I think that all religions, so I think cultism has a spectrum. And I think that all religions have the opportunity to be a cult, and that word, I guess, meaning full control over your behavior and your intellect and thought and emotional control. So because there's other kinds of cults that, they've got multi-level marketing cults out there. And even now they call them MacBook, if you're into Macs over Androids, that sort of thing. So there's different kinds of cults. But I want to say this, and the reason I want to say that is because my family, I was raised during the 90s, during this whole purity culture. And I would have never called our religion a cult back then, because we always talked, basically, we just, if we saw a cult on TV, I think during that time, there was yoga cults and all kinds of stuff coming out. And so the cult was, to my parents, something completely different than what we were actually in. But if you look back at what we were in during the 90s, especially in that whole purity culture and Joshua Harris and having to, I had to marry Jesus and go in front of the whole congregation and be shamed for being a woman and having a sinful nature and, everything that was wrong with my body, which I never even knew was wrong. They just required me to believe was wrong in the first place. It was one of those kinds of situations. I think when it comes to sex, religion specifically, and cults, or we're kind of putting those together at this time, they're like, they make that whole subject more, they put it on a pedestal more than it actually should have ever been put on a pedestal in the first place. They make it weird. They make it wrong. They make it shameful. They do. I mean, look what Christina went through, right? But I would have never actually had any sexual issues or problems if I wasn't told that I was disgusting and broken and a whore and all these things in the first place, because I didn't think that about myself, and the sexual encounters I had as a young girl, like 16, 17 years old or whatever, they felt phenomenal. They felt great. It was loving. It was wonderful. That nothing in my body said that was wrong. It was only the shame that the cult or the church or the religion brought on that caused me to feel that way. The other side of that I wanted to just add into this conversation right here is that belief that once you've got your perfect partner and God's given you exactly who you're supposed to be with, you're supposed to be able to switch like that. Like, so you're first believing that you cannot have sex, you cannot do anything, you have to be on this straight and narrow. Girls, you need to cover up so you don't actually make the boys, have any sexual thoughts. Okay. But once you're married, then as you lay in that bed with your now husband or wife, all of that shame, blame, guilt, fear, everything's supposed to just magically disappear. But anyone who's been in that situation now knows and has experienced that that stuff doesn't just disappear. That's been literally programmed into your body, and sexual experiences with the now new perfect partner are uncomfortable and awkward. And typically the woman still feels that she shouldn't be having sex on a regular basis. She definitely feels weird if the husband asks for something a little bit strange. The husband a lot of times can have issues as well, not as often as the girls, but it happens. It happens. And it's just a weird thing that they start controlling you with at a very young age, whether it's in Christina's way or whether it's in the way where I had to be completely chaste and perfect and all the things, you know?
It's traumatic.
Yeah, it's very traumatic.
Definitely. Steve, I think you made a great point about just like the role of shame, because, you know, even the text about like our righteousness is as filthy rags, and just believing that you are just nothing, that you're a failure. And, you know, even with your best effort, you're never going to measure up. And so there's always this like unattainable goal to perfection, that you're supposed to be perfect, but you know, you're not perfect, but then you're bad because you're not perfect. And, you know, kind of doubling back to the whole like abuse, when parents are, you know, in these cults with their children, there's families involved, you know, the indoctrination and the, you know, the faith over feelings approach also, you know, can override that parental instinct of protecting their child. You know, they believe so deeply that what they're doing is right, that it overrides that instinctual, I need to protect my child. And that's one, I think, some of the more heinous parts of a high control group and cults, that it overrides that instinctual protective nature that parents are born with, you know, to protect their children.
So true.
Wow. And that's powerful, because that's what, you know, every parent, that's the first thing you think, protect my child at all costs. I do want to double back and make something clear. Any sexual act between a man and a woman or between consenting adults is perfectly fine. When I said the act that the women didn't want to do, it was about her not wanting it. You know, when you were saying my body, you know, I can do it. So I just want to make that clear. I don't believe that that's evil. And back then I didn't believe it was evil. Actually, it was the fact that they were being forced. It was a form of, I don't want to say the R word, but, you know, we say grape on the internet. So I want to make that absolutely clear. Between consenting adults, go for it. I think it's great. So that's a different live stream though. So let me
The
ask.
religious controlled that as well. Oh, sorry. Wasn't it illegal? I think it was illegal in like Idaho. Was it Utah maybe, where you couldn't have like with your own partner, you're married as a married couple, you weren't allowed to have oral sex. I think it was actually illegal.
Yeah, they call oral goes into that category of sodomy. So yeah, there were some, that's another thing. In the cult, in the Hebrew Israelite cult, there was a little group of people who were like, oral is evil, and it was like a big deal. Oh my gosh, it's just, so let me talk about the madness. We've already been talking about it, but the madness of when you have people within, there are groups within the cult who get special favor, and they start policing. I would call them the Hebrew Hoe Patrol. That's what I called them, because they would look through our pictures and they tell me, oh, a little of your cleavage is showing. You know, they'd write that to me. So I'm laughing because it's ridiculous, but it's very serious. What about those cliques, those power cliques within the cult? Let's talk about them.
Christina, I think this is yours.
Well, so we definitely had, it was more like there was the little people, and then there was the musicians, and then there were the leadership. So the musicians, which are our group, one of our outreaches, and also how we made money was we were very musical. And so the musicians would get a lot of glory, but then they would also be constantly humiliated and put down. So they were like a class above everybody else, but also they always had to be shamed and humiliated. The leadership, and especially World Services, which were the secret communes that controlled everything. They did not have to beg on the streets for money. They were allowed to buy food. There were different rules for them and different rules for the leadership as well. There wasn't a lot of cliques within the cult because our cult was so controlled. Everybody tattled on everybody. Nobody could be trusted. Favoritism could be shown to certain women who were more yielded, which meant they had more sex. But even then, our cult was pretty weird and extreme. Friendship and personal relationships were discouraged or banned. Families were separated. So if they saw you forming a clique or forming a friendship or a relationship, then one of you might be sent off to another commune. But I will say that so our group was worldwide. There were 100,000 people in it over, the span of 50 years. At the most, we would have about 10,000 members at a time. And this was in 80 different countries. So depending on how close you were to the founder, like which region he lived in, the strictness level would change. So it would be much stricter the closer you were to the founder. A lot of times we didn't know, but Asia was one of the strictest places. Brazil and South America, not as much. So it kind of depended on where you were, how strict and how an extreme experience you had. So there you go.
It's more that fear. It's more fear factor. I wasn't, I was in one, but it was the township, so to speak. My mom, my dad they basically said, look, Stevie, there's nowhere you can go and there's nothing you can do and there's nothing you can wear that we won't know about because we've got eyes everywhere. And that was scary to me. I was like, oh, man, I can't do anything. I can't, nothing. And it's true, because if I did sneak out, and I did a few times, they heard about it because somebody would tell somebody, a small town, everybody goes to the same church. And sure enough, always in trouble. Yeah.
I think it depended on where you were in the church. Like I had been on the worship team in some churches, and I had been a youth director's wife in 2 other churches. And so the interesting thing is, we were able to form cliques in the worship team. But as a youth director's wife, nobody wanted to be friends with me at that level because they felt like I would be telling on them and going to their family, and I would be the tattler. And so it was very isolating in that way. But when I got to Hebrew Roots and the Messianic movement, I was arguing for the validity of that belief system online very heavily. And I remember one day somebody said, "You're in a cult," and they thought they had this like gotcha moment for me. And I looked up the definition of cult, and I was like, "Well, okay." Then I embraced that term. And I kind of took their power away from them. But looking back, it should have been something that, does carry that negative connotation. Instead, that all that internalized misogyny and trauma, I embraced it.
Wow. Yeah.
Wow. You know what? That's exactly what the Hebrew is. I think it's like this. Is it a Hebrew thing? That's what they would embrace. When someone would say you're in a cult, they'd be like, yeah, we're a cult. We're proud of it. So definitely. Dr. Powell, did you get a chance to speak on that?
Well, I mean,
Go ahead.
I think that it's important to recognize that a lot of times there's a hierarchy when it comes to these high control groups. And so there's a lot of times the peasants and then the leadership. And there's like a very serious divide between those two groups. And when it comes to people making decisions about their own choices, how they raise their children, a lot of times the group has say over that. And I remember, growing up, and my parents, had to read books before I got them to make sure there wasn't any bad content, or they had to like cover my eyes when there's bad commercials on TV, just because they felt that it wasn't pure, it wasn't of good report, all those other things that they found to be important. But that was also passed down from leadership, as far as this is how you raise your kids, this is what you do with your children. And they were trying to follow that because they were told that this is the way to go, and this is how you can gain prominence in the group, and that your children are like, quiet and obedient. And so, that was really kind of ingrained, as far as being quiet, being obedient, being humble, not bragging, having low self-esteem, not believing in yourself. All of those were those aspects of that.
Wow. There was something I was going to say. I was going to add, you said, just went out of my mind, but you'd said something that really triggered me. I wanted to ask a question. Let me go ahead and put that on the side and move on to something else. What about this? When I say what about, first off, I want to say thank you to every one of you. This is the second time getting to sit down with you, the three ladies, and Christina, especially. Thank you so much, because knowing the history of that, everyone has trauma, but that cult on the level of just abuse, sexual abuse, is just, my heart goes out to you and your strength. And so I'm just saying thank you. I'm giving you all a big virtual hug. So
Thank you.
I want to ask, I asked about the power groups within the cults, but what about, I want to take it back to when you leave the cult. I feel like I want to go back to that. When you leave the cult and you're thinking like, I still kind of, this come from me, of course, personal. I still believe in God. I liked this part of the, loving, and I liked this part. Some, they love to shame you and say, you're just cherry picking the Bible. And I always say, yeah, I sure am. So what about that when you leave and you still have a connection with what I call the unfathomable God? What do? Do you find yourself, I think someone talked about that, where Deborah, when she was like, she said, I feel thankful, then I should check that. So I'll start with you. What about, you still love God, you still want to do these things, but you left the cult? Let's talk about that.
Yeah, so one of the last questions that I had on a TikTok live, just before I took a break before coming on here, I was asked, how hard was it to leave religion? And I broke down and cried right there on TikTok, just because, and it's been almost like 4.5 years since I've left religion, and for it to still have that much of an impact says a lot. I loved my God, and I could never have fathomed in all my years of devotion that I would ever walk away. So when I wanted to have that connection, I was on my face on the floor in the living room, crying, praying, please don't let this be true. If you're real, I need you to step up. I need you to show yourself. And the silence was deafening. So I didn't have that. I don't know if I was the one that was talking about a love for God. I wanted it to be true initially, but once I didn't find that evidence, I was like, well, then whatever. But what was the hardest thing was being shunned by so many people. They tell you that shunning doesn't happen in all churches, but I'm pretty sure that there's a few verses, if any pastor gets up on stage and reads those passages with any kind of enthusiasm, he doesn't have to use the word shunning.
Yeah, I think one of the beautiful things about leaving a cult or a destructive or high controlling religion is the ability to think and decide for ourselves what we believe and what we think. And what I would like for all of us is to be comfortable with whatever conclusions we come to, be it the rejection of all religion or the rejection of God or embracing it. I personally believe that there is a higher power. I will never be able to believe that any human can speak for any higher power or energy or anything
Absolutely.
to
Absolutely.
me from them. And so I'm very comfortable with where I've landed spiritually. And I'm still able to be open, but only because I will never allow somebody else to speak for God to me. And if it wasn't for that, then I would have to be an atheist because that's never going to happen. So I think it's beautiful how some people have decided to be atheists and some people have decided to stay Christian. It's all about us recognizing our thoughts and needs and wishes and wants and not denying what we need and what is good for us.
Beautiful. Yeah, I agree. I think that I always tell my clients and myself, I guess this is what I discovered for myself, was it's spirituality should only ever be that which brings you joy. You, not me, you. And for me, it was, when I left, I went on a crazy hiatus and I went to Thailand and checked out Buddhism. I went to India up in the Himalayas. I went to South America and did ayahuasca. I went to Mexico and did peyote. I did I did those kinds of things. I did Indian sweat lodges and I just went on this crazy spiritual journey. I read so many books, I can't even count them anymore, and self-development stuff, seminars and all that. And I just, at the end of the day, found out for myself what filled my cup and what made me joyful on a regular basis, and what I have to do every morning when I get up. I have my own little rituals and my own little practices and my own little, mantras that I say to myself, and they bring me joy. And as long as I know I'm in my joy, then I know that I'm, for me, spiritually connected on my path, on what the path I want to be on. And I know that I can serve people from that place, and I can be a better wife and friend and, sister and all that. So you got to feel what feels right for you, and it needs to bring you joy. If it doesn't bring you joy, then it's usually somebody else's, and you're trying to fit it in to you, and it's not right.
Yeah.
And I love the whole idea of just the individuality, the lack of groupthink and being able to make your own decision. I think that's, the most important thing. I love what Christina said about just like the free will. Find what works for you. It's not always like the black and white end all be all. It's okay to acknowledge that you're on a journey, and it's okay to arrive at a different conclusion than you were, born with or, was taught to believe. And, just to have that freedom to decide and, cherry pick as you'd like. This is what I believe. This is what resonates with me, and making it your own. I think there's so much value in that. And that's what I hope everybody finds for themselves.
Oh, wow. I just want to end it and say, because we have to end with this. These were such beautiful, the input. Oh, I'm emotional. I'm feeling verklempt. Talk amongst yourselves. I teach that we have our own conceptualization of God. That is what it is. We can't force our conceptualization onto anyone else. So it's each one has their journey, and I just want to say I'm so honored to be a part of this. I'm bathing in all those last comments. That was just like spot on beautiful. And anyone out there who is in a cult, if you're trying to get out of the cult, or if you're even, you're hearing this and you're saying, wow, that sounds very familiar, please reach out, get help. You can even, if you don't know locally where to go, you can contact Esoteric right here on this, from this channel, and he will get in touch with all of us on this panel. And we're here to help make people, just love yourself. So you have your own connection, just you, with your, what I call the unfathomable God. There is no name, but you know what I'm saying, your higher power. So thank you, ladies. I bow to all of you. I'm so thrilled. Thank you. Thank you so much, Esoteric, for having me and the rest of the ladies. Anyone want to say anything before we call this a wrap? I think that was a slam dunk home run. What do you guys think?
Just
It
want to
was
say thank you.
wonderful.
Appreciate this and all of you so much.
Same here.
Yes, thank you guys for having this conversation. Thank you.
Beautiful.